If you look at the source material we are diving into today, you might think like someone accidentally mixed up two completely different stacks of paper.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, because on the very top page, you have these absolutely screaming, just chaotic financial headlines. We're talking about, predictions of an AI civil war and headlines like the market just BLUWUP.
Yeah, the classic clickbait.
Exactly. And then these shocking, supposedly leaked secrets about Trump, Mar-a-Lago, Elon Musk. I mean, it reads entirely like a sci-fi political thriller that's just, engineered to make you panic click a stock trade.
It is the literal definition of algorithmic noise.
Yeah.
And, it completely obscures the actual fundamental machinery of the economy operating underneath all that speculation.
Which is exactly why you have to just scroll right past all of that frantic clickbait to hit the actual core of our source material today. And it's a complete opposite of a flashy tech headline.
Quite literally the opposite, yeah.
Yeah. We are looking at the Q2 2026 earnings call transcript for a company called Insteel Industries, ticker symbol IN. So they make steel wire reinforcing products for concrete.
Right.
They're based in Mount Airy, North Carolina, and it is about as unglamorous, nuts and bolts, and, old school as an American manufacturing business gets.
But, that contrast is precisely what makes this specific earnings transcript so incredibly valuable. Because we spend, so much time analyzing software multiples and digital trends, right?
Oh, constantly.
But the physical reality of the economy, it always eventually dictates the digital reality.
So true. So our mission for this deep dive is to basically cut through those speculative headlines and use this one seemingly mundane foundational company as a lens to understand what is actually happening in the real economy.
Exactly.
If you want to know how global supply chains, international trade policies, and, even the artificial intelligence boom are actually functioning on a mechanical level, you don't look at the software first.
No, you definitely don't.
You look at the companies pouring the concrete and bending the steel. Now, a quick heads up as we dive in here, this earnings call touches on some highly charged political reality.
Right. Things like international tariffs, border policies, global conflicts.
Yeah, and our goal here isn't to debate the politics or take any sides whatsoever. We are strictly going to look under the hood at the mechanical, mathematical impact these policies have on a real operational business.
Yeah, we are basically analyzing the mechanics of causality, like how a policy signed on a desk translates into the price of a ton of steel on a factory floor.
Okay, let's unpack this because we need to start with the immediate reality Insteel faced in this second quarter. Because on paper, the numbers look, disastrous.
They do. They really.
We are talking about net earnings coming in at $5.2 million or 27 cents a share.
Right.
And to put that in perspective for you, a year ago in the same quarter, they were at $10.2 million or 52 cents a share.
Half. They literally have.
Yeah. They missed consensus expectations by a massive 53 cents. Shipments were down nearly 6% year over year, and their gross margin just compressed down to 9.6%.
It is a brutal contraction. And, when you read the transcript to see how CEO H.O. Woltz III and the CFO Scott Giuffruti explain this sudden plunge, they point directly to something that, it might initially sound like an excuse.
Right.
Severe, prolonged winter weather. They cite freezing temperatures stretching all the way from Texas up to New England, compacting 9 of their 11 operating facilities.
Okay, I have to admit, when I first read that, I completely rolled my eyes.
Oh, I don't blame you.
Right. Blaming the weather is the absolute oldest cliche in the corporate playbook. Like, every time a company misses their Q1 or Q2 numbers, they blame a snowstorm or, an unusually cold February.
It's the go-to.
It feels like a convenient scapegoat for poor execution because it's like, isn't it just a bit too perfectly out of their control?
Well, it frequently is a convenient scapegoat, right? For retail brands or logistics companies, sure. But for a company manufacturing steel reinforcement for concrete, weather isn't just a logistical hurdle.
Right.
It literally dictates a harsh biological and chemical reality. We have to look at the actual physics of their end product.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, when temperatures drop and stay below freezing for multiple weeks, which, is exactly what happened across their primary markets, the chemical process of hydration becomes fundamentally impossible.
Right, hydration being the reaction that actually causes the wet concrete to cure and harden around Insteel's steel mesh.
Precisely. Hydration is an exothermic reaction. It requires heat, and it generates heat.
Oh, okay.
So if the water in the concrete mixture freezes before that chemical reaction can fully take place, The concrete matrix is permanently compromised. Yeah,
Wow.
it will crack, it will fail, and it will completely lack the structural integrity required to hold, a commercial building. So a contractor cannot simply push through a freeze.
So it's essentially like baking a cake, right? I mean, you don't mix the wet ingredients like pouring the concrete if you know your oven is completely broken, which is the freezing weather in this environment.
That is a perfect analogy. Yeah, exactly. It's like running a massive factory assembly line where the main conveyor belt suddenly just seizes up and loses power.
Right.
The raw materials, the steel, the sand, the gravel, they might still be arriving at the loading dock, but you physically cannot combine them.
And the CEO actually used a really vivid phrase on the call. He said, contractors delayed these massive projects because they didn't want to, quote, open up Mother Earth 2 months before they had all their suppliers perfectly lined up.
Yeah, I loved that quote.
Right, because once you dig that foundation and expose it to a freezing winter storm, your site is just ruined.
Which really highlights the critical economic difference here between demand destruction and demand deferral.
Okay, expand on that.
Well, if consumer confidence drops and someone decides, not to buy a new television, that demand is destroyed. The manufacturer will never get that specific sale back.
They just lost a customer.
Exactly. But commercial construction operates on an entirely different premise. A multi-hundred-million-dollar infrastructure project does not get canceled just because it snowed in February.
Because the financing is already locked, the permits are pulled, the land is purchased.
Right. The demand is just deferred. The project still exists. The concrete still needs the steel reinforcement. The revenue just gets pushed out of Q2 and shoved into Q3 or Q4.
Okay, but that deferred demand creates an incredibly tense operational environment, right?
Massively.
Because while Insteel is just sitting around waiting for the ground to thaw so their customers can finally pour this concrete, their own internal costs are absolutely skyrocketing.
Yeah, the margins didn't just compress because sales volume temporarily dropped.
Right.
They compressed because the cost to acquire their foundational raw materials went through the roof during that delay.
So you have declining revenue hitting a literal wall of rising costs. Let's look at why those costs are spiking, because this is where we zoom out from a cold snap in North Carolina to the tangled reality of global trade policy.
Yeah, this gets complicated.
Because the primary raw material Insteel uses is hot-rolled steel wire rod, specifically for something called PC strand.
Right, PC standing for pre-stressed concrete. And we should clarify, this isn't your standard rebar.
No.
This is high-strength steel cable engineered to literally pre-stress the concrete.
Yeah.
It essentially pulls it tight so the concrete can hold massive, incredibly heavy loads without cracking.
Right.
It is highly, highly specialized.
And the market for that specific, highly specialized steel inside the United States is currently experiencing a severe supply chain squeeze.
Severe is putting it mildly.
Yeah. The source material points directly to the administration's Section 232 tariffs, which slapped a 50% penalty on imported PC strand steel. And the CEO noted that between August and December, this tariff did exactly what it was designed to do. It reduced the volume of cheap imported PC strand by more than 50%.
Which, on the surface, that sounds like a massive win for domestic steel mills, right? Protecting them from foreign dumping.
It does protect them, but it simultaneously exposes a massive structural deficit in American manufacturing.
Exactly.
The CEO laid out the math on the call, and it's stark. The apparent U.S. demand for wire rod is about 5 million tons every single year.
Okay.
But the total domestic production capacity is only roughly 3.5 million tons.
So the U.S. market is inherently short by 1.5 million tons before anyone even places a single order.
Exactly, because the domestic infrastructure simply isn't there anymore. In recent years, 2 major producing mills permanently closed their doors.
Wow.
Yeah, and a third mill is financially struggling and operating with severely diminished output. So in total, about 1.2 million tons of domestic capacity, which is nearly 20% of the entire country's consumption needs, was taken offline.
And most of it is gone permanently.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you are managing the supply chain for Insteel, you are staring at a domestic market that is mathematically incapable of supplying you with the raw materials you need to keep your factories running.
You're trapped.
It's the equivalent of needing a ticket to a concert venue that only has 3,500 seats, but there are 5,000 people in line.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. The domestic mills essentially become the box office, and because they are 20% short on supply, they possess absolute pricing power.
Right.
So You are forced to go to the scalpers. You have to turn to the offshore markets just to get the steel you need, paying massive premiums and dealing with complete logistical chaos.
And going offshore fundamentally alters your cash flow and your balance sheet. The CEO noted that domestic spot market prices for hot-rolled wire rod have spiked 50 to 100% over the global market price.
Which is insane.
It is. But simply buying cheaper steel from Asia or Europe doesn't actually solve the problem, because the logistics of oceanic freight require you to completely abandon just-in-time inventory practices.
Right, because you can't just order a truckload for next Tuesday. You have to buy massive bulk quantities to even justify chartering the cargo space.
Exactly. You are buying months of inventory upfront. And because of this forced reliance on offshore purchasing, Insteel has seen their net working capital rise by approximately $45 million over the last 12 months.
Let's break down what that $45 million in trapped working capital actually means for a business, right?
Please do.
It's the cash conversion cycle expanding to just a painful degree. You buy the bulk steel from overseas in January and you have to pay for it.
Right then and there.
Then it sits on a boat for 6 weeks. It sits in a customs port. It sits in your holding yard. You finally bend and engineer it in March. You deliver it in April, and the client pays you in May.
So Insteel is forced to finance that entire multi-month gap.
Exactly. Trapping $45 million of their own cash just to ensure the factory doesn't run out of wire rod.
And the friction doesn't end when that steel finally clears the U.S. port, because then you have to move it overland to your facilities.
Oh, right, the trucks.
And the CFO detailed a domestic freight environment that is basically cascading into failure. We are seeing localized inflation created by a collision of disconnected global and domestic events.
Right. First, you have the geopolitical conflict involving Iran, which caused global maritime insurance rates and diesel fuel costs to just spike rapidly.
So the truck itself is suddenly much more expensive to operate.
But then you have a severe labor constraint. And again, impartially here, the CEO noted that recent domestic immigration efforts effectively removed thousands of non-English-speaking truck drivers from the U.S. highway system.
Which is particularly devastating for Insteel because of the type of logistics they require.
Huh.
You cannot load 40-foot bundles of industrial steel wire into the back of a standard enclosed dry van trailer.
No, you'd never get it in there.
Right. You need specialized flatbed trucks that can be loaded from the side or top with heavy cranes and forklifts. So the flatbed market is already a spiralized, constrained subset of the trucking industry. When you simultaneously spike the cost of diesel and suddenly shrink the pool of available flatbed drivers, the remaining drivers gain immense leverage.
The statistic the CEO cited is staggering. Currently, more than 40% of all flatbed loads tendered to carriers are being rejected.
3%.
40%. If you call 10 trucking companies to move your steel, 4 of them just flat out say no.
Because they can. If another manufacturer down the road is offering a route that pays slightly more, or, doesn't involve waiting at a congested port, the driver simply rejects Insteel's load and takes the better offer.
The compounding nature of this is just wild.
Yeah.
You have a company in North Carolina. A freeze halts their concrete pours, delaying their revenue. Meanwhile, a 50% tariff forces them into a domestic market that is 1 million tons short on supply. That forces them to buy from overseas, trapping $45 million in working capital on cargo ships. When the steel finally gets here, an international conflict makes the diesel too expensive, and domestic border policies mean there aren't enough flatbed drivers to haul it, leading to a 40% rejection rate.
It's a perfect storm.
And the final mathematical result of all those colliding factors, the published prices for their primary raw material rose $90 per ton in a single quarter.
It is a phenomenal real-world example of how macroeconomic policy and geopolitical friction trickle down into the microeconomic reality of a single corporate balance sheet.
So with all these massive headwinds, the weather delays, the tariffs, the trapped cash, the $90 a ton price spikes, the 40% flatbed rejection rate, what is actually keeping this company and, the broader commercial construction sector afloat?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why wouldn't they just shutter operations until the supply chain normalizes?
Because they are being heavily anchored by the exact same phenomenon driving those chaotic clickbait headlines we discussed at the start.
You mean the artificial intelligence and cloud computing boom?
Exactly.
It always comes back to AI right now. But how does that actually connect to steel mesh?
Well, when you look at the broader macro indicators the CFO provided, The general private non-residential construction market is, to use his exact words, essentially on its back.
Ouch.
Yeah. He cited the Architectural Billings Index, or the ABI, which is a leading economic indicator that predicts future construction spending by about 9 to 12 months based on architect design activity.
Okay.
The ABI is currently sitting at 49.4. And in that index, anything under 50 indicates an overall market contraction.
But there was a massive bright spot offsetting that contraction, right?
Yeah.
Because he also cited the Dodge Momentum Index, which tracks commercial projects officially entering the planning phase.
Right.
That index actually grew by 1.8% in March. And the specific engine driving that growth was commercial planning activities supported by incredibly strong data center construction.
Data centers are the physical anchors of the digital cloud. When we talk about generative AI models processing billions of parameters or global cloud computing infrastructure, we are really talking about massive, specialized, hyper-dense buildings.
Yeah.
The servers inside these data centers are incredibly heavy, and they generate massive amounts of heat, which requires multi-level, industrial-scale, liquid cooling structures.
Right, which are also super heavy.
Exactly. Building facilities that can support that kind of physical weight and infrastructure requires tens of thousands of tons of Insteel's engineered structural mesh and pre-stressed concrete.
It's so fascinating. The CEO even mentioned that sometimes their own sales teams don't even realize their products are going into a data center.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they simply sell their legacy reinforcing steel to a contractor who is precasting concrete wall panels. And it's only later they discover those specific panels are being erected to house the servers running the next big artificial intelligence tool.
That's incredible.
Management explicitly noted that they expect this data center construction boom to provide a solid runway of demand for the next 5 years.
What's fascinating here is that it's a guaranteed pipeline of foundational infrastructure demand.
But I want to look at the vulnerabilities here for a second. Given the absolute mess of a supply chain we just outlined, the flatbed driver shortages, the 45 million tied up in inventory, the tariffs aren't data centers uniquely at risk for massive schedule delays.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they don't just need concrete. They require incredibly complex, globally sourced technology. They need massive, heavy-duty electrical transformers, specialized silicon, advanced cooling switches.
Right.
If Insteel can't even get a flatbed truck to move raw steel rod across North Carolina, how are these tech companies reliably sourcing specialized transformers from overseas?
Well, that is the exact vulnerability an analyst named Tyson Bauer zeroed in on during the Q&A portion of the call.
Oh, nice.
He asked management point blank, aren't these massive tech projects ripe for logistical delays? And the CEO was very candid. He essentially agreed that delays on the technology side are highly probable.
Okay, so he admits it.
He does. But he reiterated the concept of deferred demand. From Insteel's perspective, a delay on a transformer is just a delay.
Right.
Even if a multi-billion-dollar data center gets pushed back 6 or 8 months because they are waiting on an electrical switch, the physical foundation of that building still has to be poured eventually. The structural demand for the steel is permanently locked into the architectural blueprints.
So for a legacy manufacturing business, having a guaranteed 5-year pipeline of structural demand is basically the ultimate safety net, even if the timeline shifts slightly quarter to quarter.
Exactly.
But having a guarantee of future demand doesn't actually solve the immediate present-day crisis of plunging margins and skyrocketing raw material costs. Which brings us to how Insteel's management is actually navigating this tightrope to protect the business right now.
And this is where we see the sheer power of a pristine balance sheet. We've established that the supply chain is chaotic and their shipment volumes dropped by nearly 6% due to the weather.
Right. So imagine you are running this company, your sales volume is shrinking, you've got $45 million trapped on cargo ships just to secure raw materials, and your freight costs are bleeding you dry. What is your immediate reaction?
Panic.
Right. In a standard, highly leveraged company, this is the exact moment. Management panics. They start slashing prices to steal market share, desperately trying to get cash in the door just to make their monthly debt payments.
But Insteel did the exact opposite. Because they aren't desperate, they were able to demonstrate massive pricing power. Despite falling volumes, they raised their average selling prices by 14.2% year over year.
And they didn't even stop there. The transcript notes they implemented another price increase in April.
Wow.
Raising prices by 14% when your sales volume is dropping takes an incredible amount of corporate confidence.
It takes confidence, but it is also a mechanical necessity. They are effectively passing the rising costs of labor, diesel, and that $90 a ton wire rod increase directly onto the market.
Right.
And the only reason they can enforce those price hikes without the company collapsing is their underlying financial health.
Yeah, let's look at the metrics the CFO provided, because despite what looks like a terrible quarter on the surface, their operating cash flow still provided $4.8 million.
Right.
They ended the quarter sitting on $15.1 million in cash. But the most critical metric in this entire deep dive, they have zero borrowings on a $100 million revolving credit facility.
Zero debt.
Yeah.
In a macroeconomic environment where interest rates are hovering around 5%, having absolutely no debt dragging down your balance sheet
Yes,
is a superpower.
it is.
It allows you to absorb macro shocks without flinching. Furthermore, the CFO noted that their current inventory, that massive stockpile of offshore steel they bought, is valued at an average unit cost that is actually favorable relative to current replacement costs. So as they move into Q3, as the weather warms up, allowing contractors to finally pour that concrete, and as those 14% price increases take full effect, they are mathematically positioned for a very solid margin recovery.
And they aren't just playing defense either. Because they aren't servicing massive debt, they are fully committed to a $20 million capital expenditure plan for the year.
Right.
They are actively spending money to grow their engineered structural mesh business and upgrade their facilities to be more efficient. They are looking past the current quarter's supply chain noise, and they're just playing the long game.
They are basically using their balance sheet as a fortress, passing the costs along where the market will bear it, funding their own internal upgrades, and simply waiting for the ice to thaw.
So, what does this all mean? It all circles back to the theme of our dive today, the disconnect between the screaming headlines and the actual mechanics of the economy.
Exactly.
When you look at the panic over AI wars and market blowups, it feels chaotic. But when you look at a company pouring the concrete and bending the steel, you see a rational, complex machine.
You really do.
You see a business grappling with the real-world physics of freezing weather, the heavy financial friction of 50% tariffs, and the reality of a truck driver shortage. But you also see a highly resilient system quietly building the literal foundations for the next 5 years of the tech boom, completely protected by disciplined accounting.
It forces you to look at the fine print of causality. And, speaking of fine print, there's one final, incredibly revealing paradox buried at the very end of the Q&A session that perfectly encapsulates this disconnect between government policy and business reality.
Oh, this involves a different set of tariffs, right?
Yes, the IEPA tariffs. These are separate trade penalties that affected Insteel's purchase of capital equipment and spare manufacturing parts.
Right.
The CEO noted that the federal government has collected roughly $160 billion in these specific tariffs. But recently, the Supreme Court took action, and the Court of International Trade is now requiring that these tariffs be formally refunded.
Wait, $160 billion being injected back into the economy? I mean, if you read that in a headline, it sounds like a massive restorative windfall for a domestic manufacturer like Insteel, who was forced to pay those higher prices for their equipment.
Exactly. You'd assume the company that bore the financial burden is made whole.
Yeah.
But the CEO explained the legal mechanism of the refund, and here's the catch. Legally, the refunds are issued exclusively to the importer of record.
Uh-oh.
Right. Insteel is the end user. They absorb the cost. The tariff was a literal, explicit line item on the invoices they paid to their vendors. But Insteel wasn't the official entity that imported the part.
Let me get this straight. Insteel pays the financial penalty, but the vendor, the middleman who just facilitated the import, gets the multi-million-dollar refund check from the government.
Precisely. The CEO point-blank told the analysts they are not booking any expected receivables for this refund.
Wow.
Why? Because it is highly improbable that the middleman will ever voluntarily pass that refunded money back down the chain to the manufacturer who actually paid the price.
It is the ultimate example of the headline versus the reality.
It really is.
The headlines will loudly proclaim that the government is fixing a trade mistake and refunding $160 billion to support American industry. But when you look at the actual accounting of a company bending the steel, the manufacturer is left holding the original bill, and the middleman walks away with the bag.
The literal bag holder.
You simply cannot understand how the economy works by reading the flashy headlines. You have to look at the fine print on the invoice for a spare steel part. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the nuts and bolts beneath the noise, and we'll catch you next time.